So I was in the middle of making a fun Shadow Priest guide, and then we get hit with this nerf. Let's talk about it and talk about how it changes Shadow Priest in Season of Discovery. Now, first things first. This nerf was warranted. You know, Shadow or Death hit really hard, especially for being an instant cast ability. So let's talk about the nerf, and let's talk about the compensation we got for the nerf, and just talk about the overall effect it has on Shadow Priest. So what's the meat of it? Well, Shadow or Death base damage before modifiers decreased by 40%, and the spell power coefficient adjusted to 42.9% was higher than that. So overall, it's a 33 to 40% damage reduction on Shadow or Death. Totally fair, totally warranted. Nobody's going to complain about that. But there are other things to complain about, which I will do promptly in a second. So what does this mean? That change alone is about a 40 DPS nerf for Shadow Priest in PvE content. Shadow or Death on its own was about 100 DPS, so subtract 40%, and there you go. Now, the compensation we received for that. Mind Spike damage increased by 10%, Void Plague damage increased by 10%. These are nice, but don't really make up for the fact that we lost so much damage for Shadow or Death, and let me explain. Mind Spike alone does about 100 DPS in a raid encounter, so 10% of that is 10 DPS, which still leaves us at minus 30 DPS. Now, Void Plague is interesting because Void Plague was already worse than Twisted Faith, which is a rune on the same slot as it in single target. And it's just gotten nerfed because the coefficient on that spell was too high. It was taking an extra 20% of our spell power that it shouldn't have been and getting applied to the spell. So that 20% was removed, but then its base damage, or its damage, is getting increased by 10%, which means its damage probably isn't really changing at all when you factor in those two things together. So what that means is Void Plague's damage essentially remains unchanged, Mind Spike gets 10% more damage, and then Shadow or Death is reduced by 40%. From a PvP perspective, perfectly fine, nerf Shadow or Death, totally agree that that's what should happen. But from a PvE perspective, this is really bad because they're essentially taking 30 DPS away from Shadow Priest. And if you've checked out Warcraft logs in the last day or two, you'll see that mages and warlocks are the top dogs when it comes to casters, and Shadow Priest definitely is not. Shadow Priest is good, but there's no reason to nerf them by 30 DPS. And I think that's what irks me the most about these changes, where with the Boomy change, they essentially rerouted the damage that they lost from Star Surge into Starfire so that they didn't really lose damage. But here, this is almost like a 8 to 10% nerf to our damage, 30 DPS. So it's really unfortunate that they decided to take this route. It does help us in multi-target because you can have Void Plague on 3 targets at once with its 5-second cooldown, and since it lasts 15 seconds. But overall, it's going to hurt us, especially on single target, which is what I don't like. I wish that they would either buff Mind Spike damage more, have Twisted Faith apply its bonus damage to Mind Spike, because right now Twisted Faith only applies its bonus damage to Mind Blast and Mind Flay, and in PvE, Mind Flay has just become a dead spell with the addition of Mind Spike. So there's some changes that I'd like to see them implement for balancing reasons. Again, totally fine with the Shadow or Death change. I think it was warranted. Nothing wrong there. I just wish that they would try to compensate the damage loss a little bit better than they have here. It also feels bad that Void Plague getting its damage buffed in this way essentially makes Twisted Faith a dead rune. Because if Void Plague is better on single target, Twisted Faith has no place anywhere. So I think that they should try to look at that rune, and I think if they reduce the overall effectiveness of it, instead of buffing the spells by 50%, maybe buff them by 30 or 40%, but have it apply to Mind Spike as well, would be a really good change so that we have a clear differentiation between Twisted Faith being a single target rune and Void Plague being a multi-target rune. Anyway, that's my thoughts on these changes. Overall, it's warranted. It's kind of unfortunate to lose damage in PvE, which is primarily what I care about. But Shadow's still going to be really good. Hopefully this doesn't, get your hopes down. There's still reason to play it. It's still going to be an awesome class in SOD Phase 2. It's just going to be slightly less awesome now. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope I helped you understand what these changes are. My name's Fanspace, and I'll see you in the next one.